There's plenty of videos on the Mike Hearon disappearance, but so far none of them really retrace his steps. So today, I'll take you to Happy Valley in Blount County and show you the last steps of Mr. Hearon. On Saturday morning, August 23, 2008, Mike called his son Andy to tell him he'd be stopping by his house to pick up his riding mower. He said he'd drive to his 100-acre property in Happy Valley to do some yard work. He grew up there and had a second house with a large patch of grass that needed regular mowing detached from his home at the end of a long driveway. I believe this is the home, judging from newspaper photos that show his sons standing in front of the barn. Andy said sure enough, and they ended the call. At 10 a.m., Andy's father passed him on the short drive south. He was riding his truck down from Maryville with the lawnmower secured to the trailer hitch. The drive was only about 15 miles, and both communities are in Blount County, but Happy Valley has a much lower population, with only 500, compared to Maryville's more than 20,000. The Hearon family is tied to the small valley. In fact, the earliest marked grave at the Happy Valley Missionary Baptist Church is that of Janie Hearon, who died in 1874. The last grave is Verl, Mike's father. He served as a deacon and would have noticed his son's absence right away when he didn't show up for church. This church is in the center of the populated section, but the Chiloe Baptist Church can be found at the southern edge of Happy Valley Road, a stone's throw away from the reservoir. There's only one way in and out of the valley on Happy Valley Road, which cuts right through it. To the north it connects to Maryville, and to the south to the Chiloe Reservoir, minutes away. Mike drove from the north, turned left on Bell Branch Road, and continued to his driveway at the very end. This is the same route we're driving now. From what can be pieced together, he parked his truck at the end of the driveway, but didn't unhitch the lawnmower. He then went up to his house, unlocked it, hopped on his ATV, and drove back towards Happy Valley Road, passing Grady Whitehead on his left. Like he did every time he set out, he gave his elderly neighbor a friendly wave. There's no real way of knowing, but Mike probably used his key set to unlock his home, then came back to his truck parked at the end of the long driveway, and decided to set them on the passenger seat. Now, while this area is usually very safe, and I could understand leaving your wallet in the open for a few minutes, I can't really see someone doubling back to their home just to put the keys away if they're only going to be gone for a half hour or so. What this says to me is that he wasn't exactly rushing or anything, but he certainly wouldn't have left his valuables in the open for as long as he did. He wouldn't have gone on a camping trip, but he might have gone out for an hour or two. The following morning was Sunday, and Mike didn't show up for work. Now, Aiden Mattis at LoreLodge said he couldn't find information on whether or not he was religious enough that his family would notice him being absent from church. I think I should point out, though, that Verl Hearon, his father, was the deacon at the church. Reports differ, but it was either his mother or brother who walked to the end of Bell Branch Road, an easy stroll because they lived right next to him. They saw the truck parked at the bottom of the driveway with the tow still connected. Now, whoever responded saw the ATV in the barn and figured he was out for a walk in the woods, which wasn't unusual for him. To be safe, they contacted his sons, one of whom checked on his property in Maryville, about 15 miles north. He wasn't there, but a man has a right to explore the forest, especially in an area as close to a national park as this. There's not much cell service in the valley, so nobody thought it unusual that he didn't answer calls. On Monday, his sons, Andy and Matt, waited for him at work in Maryville. He employed them at his own construction firm, and when they saw he wasn't there, alarms finally started going off. They waited some time, and when it was obvious he wouldn't answer his phone or show up, they drove to his home in Happy Valley. They immediately realized what was wrong. See, yesterday they thought he'd left his ATV in the barn, but remembered he'd just got a new one. The new ATV that he'd parked up by his house was missing, and as soon as they saw this, they phoned the sheriff. They knew immediately that something was very, very wrong. This was about 5:30 p.m. on Monday. Sergeant Mike Surratt arrived in less than an hour, but the sun had set about 15 minutes earlier before he could start looking around the property. The search truly began around 8:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning, meaning his trail had been mostly lost since he went missing on early Sunday morning. It had been raining steadily since 6:30 or 7 p.m. By all accounts, this search was very professional, and volunteers from the National Park Service, the Sheriff's Department, the Fire Department, and the local community all showed up. Again, remember the Hearon family had been in the tiny valley for well over a century, and everybody seemed to love Mike. Other than his family, perhaps nobody loved him more than the last man who saw him, his elderly neighbor Grady Whitehead. The 80-year-old man had watched Mike grow up as a baby and have two sons of his own. Grady was over 80 years old, lived across the street, and was the first man to show up for the search every day and the last to go home. He was also a master tracker, employed in the Smokies as a search and rescue team member from 1955 until 1988. Authorities rightly realized that if they found Mike's ATV, they would have the biggest clue as to what happened to him, so a grid search was conducted. It was discovered very quickly under suspicious circumstances. Mike Heron's property was at the end of Bell Branch Road, and you can see as we leave here, we enter onto Happy Valley Road, which, coming from the left, is the reservoir, and the right is Maryville, which is where he had a business, but a short distance down the street here is the Happy Valley Loop that his ATV was found on. Now, what's so unusual about the police narrative is that the Sun said that it was found parked behind an abandoned cabin about 30 yards off the Happy Valley Loop, and the police don't really list this in their police report. In fact, they deny any knowledge of that cabin existing, that abandoned cabin 30 yards off the road. So I thought I would drive the entire loop and point out areas where this might be the cabin. Back there is an abandoned cabin right off of the main road in town. And if you take a look at the layout of this on Google Maps, this sort of just goes up, I believe, a little bit to the west of Happy Valley Road, which is the main artery through town, and goes on for about a mile, and then heads right back onto the main road. So I'll just drive the whole road for you. And here we are again on Happy Valley Road. You can see here on a map how this road is set up. Happy Valley Loop and Happy Valley Road. Referencing the report, it was, quote, about 30 yards off Happy Valley Loop, about a mile from Mike's home. You would think that more descriptive language would be used. Is it about a mile? 3/4 of a mile? 100 yards? Is it as the crow flies or off the road? When Mike's son Matt saw it, he knew something was wrong immediately. It was found by an abandoned cabin up a hill stashed in a weird spot. Then Sergeant Surratt said, quote, it was just really oddly placed, but he wouldn't elaborate beyond that. Well, I don't think that's the cabin. It's about 30 yards off the road, but I don't believe it to be abandoned because I saw it was lived in. We're sitting on Happy Valley Loop right now, and if I were to guess where the cabin was, the one that was supposedly 30 yards off of Happy Valley Loop, it might either be back here or on the opposite side of the road over this field. Perhaps Sergeant Mike Surratt and the Sun could have mistaken this for an old cabin, because Mike Surratt at least said that the ATV was parked outside of it, right up against it. And you'll hear some of the narrative here. One news report said it was found sideways, but the Hearon brothers, Mike Hearon's sons, implied it was backed into the bushes. They said their dad wouldn't do that without a cause, leading me to think it had obviously been parked to not be seen immediately from the road. Mike's keys were still in the ignition and in the off position, but the ignition switch itself was still on, draining the battery. Mike also didn't frequent Happy Valley Loop and didn't have friends who lived on that stretch of road, so it's a mystery why he'd consciously drive up there. Turning left at the end of the road would have taken him to the reservoir, but this section of road is just a subdivision. And to give you a bit of an idea of how Happy Valley is sort of laid out, here's Happy Valley Road, the only way in and out of this small community from north and south. And as we drive north, that's the direction that Mike Heron would have gone back to Maryville, his home where he actually owned his business. To the left is the Baptist church, where on Sunday morning he didn't show up, which raised a few alarms. And to the left here is Happy Valley Loop. Just down this road is where his ATV was found. You also have the whole issue with him turning off the keys but not the ignition, something that someone would do who's never really driven an ATV before. The tracks led only to the road and no trace of him was found around the cabin. Clearly he wasn't exploring the area. It was a quick decision on somebody's part to drive the ATV to a discreet place and leave it as soon as possible. Police even claimed they didn't know a cabin was in that area until they located it. The following morning, the search was expanded to cover the entire ridge overlooking Happy Valley. On August 30th, 2008, the search was called off. He'd been missing for about 1 week. Now, a few theories have surfaced online, but they usually play off of inappropriate Appalachian stereotypes. The idea that Mike Hearon stumbled on a still or a ginseng root hunting team and was killed for it is ridiculous. I say this because pretty much everybody in Happy Valley knew their neighbors, and Mike would have been shooed off at worst if he found anything less serious than a massive drug operation. Whoever parked Mike's ATV off Happy Valley Loop must have known they'd be spotted no matter where they took it if they tried driving away. After all, ATVs make plenty of noise, and driving north or south takes you past the most populated areas, followed by a stretch of several miles of mostly empty road. Because he waved at Grady Whitehead, it's very likely he was either ambushed at the last part of Bell Branch Road, or that he'd been exploring the woods to the west of Happy Valley Road when something happened and his ATV was stashed here. Had he been killed deep in the woods, though, his ATV would have been concealed much more easily. Whatever happened to him probably happened soon after he waved to his neighbor Grady Whitehead. When Mike Hearon went missing, he was 51 years old, 5'10", 185 pounds, and easily identifiable, with a tattoo, scars, different-sized feet, and a chipped tooth. He had no problems with drugs or alcohol and knew the woods as someone who grew up around them would. So what do I think happened to Mike Hearon? I actually came to this conclusion while exploring eastern Tennessee and filming some about family feuds and Civil War bushwhacking. LoreLodge mentions that Cades Cove is nearby, which was pro-Union in the war between the states. In fact, when the Ordinance of Secession was passed in 1861, 1,766 Blount Countyans voted to stay in the Union, while less than 500 voted to join the Rebs. The small town of Hazel Creek to the east, past the Gap in North Carolina, was pro-Confederate. This led to feuding and animosity between some families that would last for years after the war had ended. One of these pro-Union partisans was executed midway through the Gap on the state border. Baze Shaw's grave is in a sorry state on the way to Hearon's farm. On December 7, 1864, Baze and his 17-year-old son, Joe Barry, were captured with several others by Confederate W.R. Abbott at Little Toccoa Creek in Monroe County, Tennessee, during a roundup of their opposition. Because of his youth, Joe Barry Shaw was released, but Baze and others were soon en route to Asheville, North Carolina. Soon after leaving the Hardin Farm, which is now the site of Calderwood, Tennessee, where the group had camped for the night, Baze was shot by the rebels for some unknown reason and left in a low gap on the old Tennessee Turnpike at the Big Poplar turn of Highway 129. To get there, you turn west at the Tail of the Dragon in Swain County, North Carolina. Before you stretch 318 switchbacks on only 11 miles of road. This area draws motorcycle clubs, hippies, car enthusiasts, and backpackers. After all, just over the Gap and in Tennessee, you've got a nice reservoir with backcountry camping. If you wanted to hitchhike from Knoxville to Nantahala, you would pass right through Maryville, south to Happy Valley, and up over the pass to North Carolina. In my opinion, Mike Hearon wasn't killed by a local. He wouldn't have been killed by a marijuana grower because the area isn't remote enough to allow a crop to grow big enough to really kill anybody over. Mike was in all likelihood murdered by one or more adrenaline junkies fresh off the switchbacks from North Carolina, possibly squatting in Happy Valley to recuperate before they made the ride back to Knoxville. After the road, whoever killed him knew the roads well enough, but didn't know the locals at all, so they must have driven his ATV to the stop sign past the church, turned left, and hit it as best they could. Mike Hearon's father passed away not long ago, still waiting for some sort of closure. He was a man of God. We owe this to his remaining family to find out what happened to him, and like Aidan Mattis says, to a lot of people involved, it just seems like the police aren't forthcoming with information. If the case has gone cold and there's a renewed public interest, I would really encourage the police to work with community leaders and start delving into this case a little bit more.